In 1999, Bill Gates was asked directly about Linux, the free open-source operating system a Finnish graduate student had started building less than a decade earlier in his dorm room. Gates' answer was dismissive, confident, and specific. Linux, he said, was no real threat to Microsoft's core business. It lacked the coordination, the polish, and the business-level support that serious companies actually needed. Windows had the market. Linux had hobbyists. 26 years later, in June of last year, Bill Gates sat down for dinner with that same graduate student, Linus Torvalds, by then the single most influential operating system creator on the planet. And here's the detail that actually makes this story worth telling. It was the first time the two men had ever met in person. Not the first time in years, the first time, period. Let's actually sit with that for a second, because it's a genuinely strange fact once you think about it directly. Two people whose decisions, made independently and often in direct opposition to each other, shaped almost the entire trajectory of modern computing. The operating system running on the overwhelming majority of the world's servers and the operating system that dominated the personal computer for 3 decades had simply never occupied the same room, until a private dinner arranged by one of Microsoft's own senior executives finally put them at the same table. Think about everything that happened in the technology industry across those 26 years between Gates's dismissive 1999 comment and this dinner. The dot-com boom and bust, the rise of the modern internet as we know it today, running overwhelmingly on Linux servers. The birth of the smartphone with Android, itself built on the Linux kernel, becoming the single most widely deployed operating system on the planet by unit count. Cloud computing emerging as an entire industry, with Linux as its default foundation. Through every single one of those transformations, Gates and Torvalds' respective creations were constantly interacting, competing, and eventually collaborating at a civilizational scale, and yet the two men themselves had simply never been introduced. Let's start with the dinner itself, because the details of how it actually happened are almost as interesting as the fact that it happened at all. The gathering was hosted by Mark Russinovich, Microsoft's Azure CTO, a name that carries its own significant weight in this story, which we'll get to shortly. Russinovich shared a photograph from the evening on LinkedIn, along with a caption that instantly became the defining quote of the entire story. "I had the thrill of a lifetime, hosting dinner for Bill Gates, Linus Torvalds, and David Cutler. Linus had never met Bill, and Dave had never met Linus. No major kernel decisions were made, but maybe next dinner." That caption is worth unpacking piece by piece, because every name in it represents a genuinely significant piece of computing history. And understanding who was actually sitting at that table is what makes the photograph as remarkable as it became once it started circulating. Start with David Cutler, the third name in that lineup, because his presence at the table adds a layer to this story that a lot of the surrounding coverage undersold. Cutler is the architect largely responsible for the core design of Windows NT, the fundamental architecture underlying essentially every version of Windows released since the 1990s, from Windows 2000 all the way through today's Windows 11. Before that, Cutler had already built a legendary reputation at Digital Equipment Corporation, where he designed operating systems including RSX-11 and VS VMS. At 83 years old at the time of this dinner, Cutler represents a direct living link back to an even earlier generation of operating system design, predating both Gates and Torvalds' careers by a meaningful stretch. His own comment on the evening, according to Russinovich, was equally notable. Cutler had never personally met Torvalds either, despite the two men's work sitting at the absolute foundation of the two dominant operating system philosophies in modern computing. It's worth understanding just how significant Cutler's own body of work actually is, since his name tends to be far less recognizable to a general audience than either Gates or Torvalds. Windows NT wasn't simply an incremental update to earlier consumer versions of Windows. It was an entirely new, ground-up operating system architecture, designed specifically to bring the kind of stability, security, and reliability found in serious enterprise and workstation computing into a product Microsoft could eventually push out to ordinary consumers. Every mainstream version of Windows released since Windows 2000 has ultimately descended from that NT architecture, meaning an enormous share of the world's Windows running devices today are still, at their core, running on foundational design decisions Cutler made decades ago, recruiting him away from Digital Equipment Corporation in the late 1980s, specifically to build that architecture is often cited as one of Microsoft's most consequential hiring decisions in the company's history. Then there's Russinovich himself, the actual host, whose own background makes him a genuinely fitting person to be the one finally bringing these figures together. Before joining Microsoft, Russinovich founded SAIS Internals, a suite of deep technical Windows diagnostic and administration tools that became legendary among serious systems administrators for their ability to peer directly into the internals of how Windows actually behaved under the hood. Microsoft acquired sysinternals in 2006, and Russinovich has remained with the company ever since, eventually rising to become the CTO of Microsoft's entire Azure cloud division, a role that puts him, on a daily basis, at the center of exactly the kind of Windows and Linux coexistence this whole story is really about, since Azure runs enormous amounts of both. There's a specific irony worth appreciating about Russinovich being the one to host this particular dinner. Sysinternals, in its original form, existed specifically to help administrators understand Windows at a level of technical depth Microsoft's own official documentation often didn't provide, a tool built by someone deeply embedded in the Windows ecosystem, for people who needed to understand the ecosystem more thoroughly than Microsoft itself typically explained it. That same instinct toward deep, technical curiosity, applied decades later to Microsoft's own cloud infrastructure, has made Russinovich one of the most credible internal voices arguing for genuine, substantive Linux support inside Microsoft's products, rather than the more superficial nods to open source compatibility the company sometimes offered in earlier eras. So think about the actual composition of that dinner table for a moment. The creator of Linux, the architect of Windows NT, the founder of Microsoft, who built the commercial empire around Windows, and the current Microsoft executive overseeing a cloud platform that now runs both operating systems side by side at a scale neither Gates nor Cutler could have fully anticipated when they were building the foundations of Windows decades earlier. That's not just four accomplished individuals having a nice meal together. That's several genuinely distinct eras of operating system history, physically sitting at the same table, several of them meeting each other in person for the very first time, despite decades of overlapping, often adversarial influence on the same industry. A coincidence of timing and geography finally correcting itself after roughly half a century of these four careers running in parallel without ever quite intersecting in person. Now let's go back and actually understand why Gates' 1999 dismissal of Linux mattered so much, and why the gap between that comment and this dinner is genuinely worth measuring. In 1999, Microsoft's institutional relationship with Linux and open source software generally was openly hostile, not merely skeptical. Gates' own comment about Linux lacking business-level coordination and support reflected a broader company position holding that open source, community-developed software simply couldn't compete with a properly resourced, centrally coordinated commercial product like Windows. That position hardened considerably over the following years. Steve Ballmer, who succeeded Gates as Microsoft's CEO, famously escalated the rhetoric considerably further in 2001, describing Linux as, in his own words, a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches, language that went well beyond simple competitive dismissal into something closer to an active, hostile campaign against the entire open source model Linux represented. It's worth being precise about the specific fear driving that hostility, since it wasn't simply generic corporate rivalry. Microsoft's business model at the time depended almost entirely on selling proprietary software licenses, and the GPL, the open source license governing the Linux kernel, carries what's often called a viral or copyleft property, meaning software built on top of GPL licensed code often has to be released under those same open terms. To a company whose entire revenue model was built on tightly controlled closed source licensing, that legal structure looked less like a competing product and more like a genuine threat to the underlying business model itself, which helps explain why Microsoft's response escalated well beyond ordinary competitive marketing into legal threats and aggressive anti-Linux campaigns. That period of open hostility lasted for years, playing out through legal threats, patent disputes, and aggressive marketing, campaigns specifically designed to discourage enterprises from adopting Linux at scale. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how adversarial the relationship between Microsoft and the open source world was during this stretch, particularly through the mid-2000s, when Microsoft's own executives were making public statements treating Linux less like a competing product and more like an existential threat to be actively fought. The shift away from that hostility didn't happen all at once, and it's worth tracing the actual sequence of changes, because it wasn't purely a Gates to Nadella switch flipping overnight either. Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation in 2016, a genuinely significant formal step, given the Linux Foundation's role as the central organizing body, coordinating Linux kernel development and open source collaboration more broadly. From there, Microsoft's involvement deepened steadily, contributing code directly to the Linux kernel, building the Windows subsystem for Linux to let Windows users run genuine Linux environments natively, and, most significantly for this specific story, building Azure into a cloud platform where a substantial share of the actual workloads running on Microsoft's own infrastructure run on Linux rather than Windows. That last point is worth sitting with directly. Microsoft's own cloud business, one of the company's largest and fastest growing revenue streams, now depends heavily on Linux running smoothly and reliably on Microsoft's own servers, serving Microsoft's own customers. Satya Nadella, who became Microsoft's CEO in 2014, is generally credited as the figure who most visibly completed that pivot, publicly declaring that Microsoft loves Linux in a shift so dramatic from the Ballmer era that it became something of a running joke across the tech industry for a period. Proof of just how far the company's official position had traveled from cancer to public affection in the span of about a decade. So by the time this dinner actually happened, the institutional relationship between Microsoft and Linux had already transformed almost completely. Microsoft's own cloud infrastructure runs Linux at massive scale. Microsoft engineers contribute directly to the Linux kernel. The open hostility of the Ballmer years had been replaced by genuine, practical, technical collaboration for the better part of a decade already, which makes the actual personal fact at the center of this story that Gates and Torvalds specifically had simply never met. Feel even stranger once you understand just how thoroughly their two worlds had already merged institutionally, well before they ever personally sat down together. It's worth being honest about why that gap might have existed, since none of the reporting on this dinner offers a definitive explanation, and it's genuinely more interesting to sit with the uncertainty than to invent a tidy explanation. Gates stepped down from his day-to-day role at Microsoft back in 2008, shifting his primary focus to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and global health and development work, meaning for most of the period during which Microsoft's relationship with Linux actually transformed. From 2014 onward, under Nadella, Gates himself was no longer centrally involved in Microsoft's daily operations or its evolving relationship with the open source world. Torvalds, for his part, has historically kept a relatively low public profile outside of the Linux kernel community itself, rarely making the rounds at industry events or corporate gatherings the way many prominent tech figures do. Put those two facts together, and a scenario where their paths simply never crossed despite decades of overlapping influence on the same industry becomes considerably less surprising than it might first appear. Less a deliberate avoidance and more a simple accident of two people moving in genuinely different professional orbits for most of the relevant period. It's also worth considering just how different these two men's day-to-day professional lives actually looked across the decades in question. Gates, even during his most active years running Microsoft, operated primarily in the world of corporate strategy, partnerships, and high-level business decisions, the kind of environment where he'd regularly cross paths with other CEOs, government officials, and business leaders, but not necessarily with an individual open-source kernel maintainer, however influential that maintainers' work happened to be. Torvalds, meanwhile, has spent the vast majority of his career deeply embedded in the technical mailing list-driven culture of kernel development itself, reviewing code contributions, and managing an enormous distributed community of volunteer developers, rather than moving through the same corporate and social circles where someone like Gates would typically operate. Two enormously influential people moving through genuinely different professional ecosystems for decades is a more mundane but probably more accurate explanation than anything more deliberate. Let's talk about what we actually know happened at the dinner itself, because the honest answer is not very much. And that's worth being upfront about rather than speculating beyond what's actually been reported. Rusinovich's own public comments were brief and lighthearted rather than substantive. His joke about no major kernel decisions being made specifically pokes fun at the idea that the dinner might have somehow functioned as a serious technical summit, when by all indications it was simply a friendly, informal social gathering between four people with an enormous shared history who happened to have never actually met. No detailed account of the actual conversation has been published by any of the attendees. We don't know what specifically Gates and Torvalds discussed, whether they talked shop about operating systems at all, or whether the evening was dominated by entirely unrelated conversation. That absence of detail is itself worth noting, because it means most of what's been written about this dinner across the tech press has been building meaning around the fact of the meeting itself and the symbolism of who was in the room, rather than reporting on any substantive content from the conversation, since none has actually been made public. That's a useful thing to be honest about, because it's tempting for a video like this one to fill that gap with speculation about what such a historically loaded conversation must have covered. The more intellectually honest approach is simply acknowledging that we don't know, and that the actual news value of this story lives entirely in the fact of the meeting happening at all, and in the 4-decade span of computing history it brought together in one room, rather than in any specific revealed content from their conversation. It's worth resisting the temptation that a lot of coverage of stories like this one gives into, treating the absence of detail as itself suspicious, or reading some deeper hidden meaning into what wasn't said publicly. Sometimes, a dinner between 4 accomplished people really is just a pleasant, unremarkable social evening, made newsworthy entirely by who happened to be sitting at the table rather than by anything specifically discussed there. Respecting that distinction, reporting what's actually known rather than manufacturing intrigue out of an information gap, is exactly the kind of honest framing this particular story deserves. It's worth spending a moment on just how differently these two men have approached their careers and their public personas, because that contrast is a big part of why this photograph resonated the way it did once it started circulating online. Gates built Microsoft into the dominant force in personal computing through an aggressive, centrally controlled, intensely commercial strategy. Windows was licensed, sold, and fiercely protected, with Microsoft's entire early business model built around controlling that intellectual property tightly. Torvalds took the essentially opposite path, releasing the Linux kernel's source code publicly and inviting an open, decentralized, volunteer-driven community of contributors from around the world to help build and improve it collaboratively, with no single company ever owning or controlling the resulting software. Those aren't just two different business strategies. They represent genuinely opposed philosophies about how software should be built, who should control it, and how innovation itself should actually be organized and incentivized. It's also worth noting a small, easily overlooked biographical detail that complicates the simple Gates built Windows, Torvalds built Linux framing most casual retellings of this story rely on. Gates himself never actually wrote an operating system. His own technical contributions center on co-creating the basic programming language, interpreter used in some of the earliest microcomputers, including the MIT's Altair, well before Microsoft became primarily known as an operating system company at all. Windows NT's actual architecture came from Cutler, not Gates directly. That doesn't diminish Gates' role as the business strategist who built Microsoft's commercial empire around Windows, but it's a useful, honest correction to the oversimplified version of this story where Gates and Torvalds are cast as two engineers who separately wrote competing operating systems by hand. The more accurate picture involves Gates as the business architect of a commercial empire and Cutler as the actual technical architect underneath it, which makes Cutler's own presence at this specific dinner, meeting Torvalds for the first time himself, arguably just as significant as the Gates-Torvalds meeting that got most of the headline attention. For decades, that philosophical opposition played out as genuine, sometimes bitter industry rivalry, particularly during the years when Microsoft was actively working to slow Linux's enterprise adoption. Watching two people who represent those specific, historically opposed philosophies sit down together for a friendly dinner, joking about kernel decisions rather than litigating old grievances, is exactly the kind of image that captures something real about how much the broader industry has actually shifted, even if the specific conversation that evening remains private. It's also worth noting how the broader tech press and online tech community reacted to this photograph once it started circulating, because that reaction is itself part of the story. Commentators across multiple outlets specifically remarked on the sheer concentration of influence sitting in that single frame. 4 individuals whose combined decisions, made independently across roughly 5 decades of computing history, shaped an enormous share of the technology infrastructure the entire world now depends on daily. One outlet described it as capturing 3 overlapping generations of tech history in a single photograph, a framing that captures something genuinely true about the moment. Cutler representing the earliest generation, working on foundational operating systems before either Gates or Torvalds had built anything, Gates representing the commercial, PC-era generation that followed, and Torvalds representing the open-source, Internet-era generation that, in many ways, has come to define how an enormous share of the world's actual computing infrastructure, servers, cloud platforms, mobile devices, actually runs today. Some of the online reaction leaned toward genuine disbelief that this meeting hadn't happened years, even decades earlier, given how thoroughly the two men's respective creations had already been intertwined by the time this dinner finally took place. Others focused more on the lighter, almost surreal novelty of the image itself, imagining, half-jokingly, what the tech industry's entire trajectory might have looked like differently had these 4 specific people crossed paths at some earlier, more consequential moment in computing history, rather than meeting decades later at a purely social dinner with, by all accounts, no substantive technical discussion actually taking place. So where does that leave the actual honest thesis of this story? I don't think this dinner represents some dramatic turning point or a hidden signal about upcoming Microsoft Linux collaboration. Rusinovich's own joking caption specifically undercuts that kind of speculation. What it represents, more modestly and more genuinely interestingly, is a symbolic capstone to a transformation that had already substantially happened, institutionally, over the preceding decade. Microsoft's relationship with Linux shifted from open hostility to genuine practical collaboration well before this dinner ever took place. Azure was already running Linux at massive scale. Microsoft engineers were already contributing to the kernel, and Nadella's Microsoft Loves Linux era was already nearly a decade old by the time this photograph was taken. The dinner didn't cause any of that shift. It simply put a human, personal face on a transformation that had already happened at the institutional level, closing a strange, lingering gap where the two most symbolically important figures in that entire story had simply never occupied the same room. That's genuinely worth reflecting on for a moment, because it says something true about how large-scale industry transformations actually happen in practice. They rarely announce themselves through a single dramatic event or a symbolic handshake between the two most famous people associated with either side. They happen gradually, institutionally, through thousands of smaller decisions. A company joining a foundation, engineers submitting kernel patches, a cloud platform quietly running more and more Linux workloads year after year, long before the individuals most associated with the original rivalry ever happened to end up in the same room together. The photograph is a nice, tidy symbol. The actual substance of the story had already been written gradually over the preceding decade. It's worth applying that same lens to other stories in this space too, since it's a pattern worth recognizing rather than treating as unique to this one dinner. The most significant shifts this channel has covered: Lenovo's quiet, 6-year-old Linux pricing option finally getting noticed, governments gradually moving away from Microsoft over years rather than in a single dramatic announcement, Microsoft's own gradual embrace of open source through the WSL and Azure Linux projects, all follow the same basic shape. The real change happens quietly, structurally, well before any single symbolic moment captures public attention and gets treated as the turning point. The turning point in most of these stories already happened. What we're usually reacting to is just the moment someone finally took a photograph of it. I want to know what you think actually explains the gap here. Genuinely just a coincidence of two people moving in different professional circles for most of the relevant period, or something more deliberate that neither side has ever really talked about publicly? And if you'd been a fly on the wall at that dinner table, what's the one question you'd have wanted to hear either of them actually answer? Gates about his 1999 comment specifically, or Torvalds about watching his own creation quietly become the foundation of the modern internet, while the company that once called it a cancer eventually became one of its biggest contributors? Tell me in the comments. I think this is exactly the kind of story where the missing details are almost more interesting than the ones we actually have. If you want more grounded coverage of the real history behind the Microsoft Linux relationship, the actual transformation, not just the symbolic moments, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll keep separating the substance of these industry shifts from the single photographs that end up standing in for them.